So thank you for appearing before the committee today, and I invite you to make a brief opening statement should you wish to do so, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. I do wish to make a brief opening statement. First point is we noticed that there was over 90 submissions to this inquiry, and we're a little bit disappointed that so few people were called to appear on privacy issues, and in fact the general public's concerns about those privacy issues. And in particular, Privacy Commissioner wasn't asked to appear, and many people that have contacted me and the Privacy Foundation have indicated how strongly they feel about this, and I'm just concerned that there wasn't a lot of representation before you today, and I'd encourage you to think about whether there could be some more, because as many people expressed disappointment. Before the 2016 census, the Australian public generally trusted the ABS. This is no longer true for many Australians. That trust was destroyed by the ABS when it changed the purpose of the census from aggregated statistical data to personal tracking. It still remains unclear what the ABS plans to do with the personal information it has collected. We've written a detailed submission on many issues, but we wish to highlight a few critical issues. This is not a small change. The ABS says in its submission at page 76, it is not a small change, but it is not a small change to propose to keep identifiable personal information about everyone in Australia. Right? This is a change that happened for this census. And I'd add that many people, the community, didn't understand that change at all. The privacy impact assessment failed to identify the privacy risks. Now, the privacy impact assessment is absolutely critical in identifying the privacy risks of Australians. The census impacts every Australian, and the privacy impact assessment produced by the ABS failed to consider in any detail whether names could be compulsorily required, the effect of keeping names, and the proposed uses to keep the personal information. The privacy impact assessment did not consider the effect of the privacy principles in any detail or the re-identification of any unique identifier proposed to be used. These are significant oversights. Names are not statistical information and cannot be compulsorily collected. The ABS refuses to provide a copy of the legal advice obtained that they relied on to tell every person in Australia that they had to compulsorily required provide their name. There is already extensive legal opinion contradicting that advice. If the legal opinion is incorrect, then millions of Australians have been misled, in fact all of them, have been misled into providing their name with threats of fines when it was not compulsory, as it was, as you heard from Mr McLennan this morning. In his view, it wasn't compulsory. We do want to cover what we think needs to be done, and we've made a series of recommendations in our submission. But firstly, I think the most important thing is to reassure Australians that they won't be fined. There was numerous threats. We followed just a continuous array of threats against Australians for not complying absolutely with the census. We think that the first thing that should be decided by the government is that no one will be fined in this situation or prosecuted because of the misleading conduct of the ABS. Secondly, legislative change is required to ensure the objective of the census to use aggregated statistical data is what happens with the census and not tracking citizens. And I might add that it should have required legislative change to make such a profound change to the purpose of the census in the first place. And so that indicates a problem with the legislation. And lastly, we want the government to acknowledge the serious and real risks of re-identification of unique identifier keys and legislate to ensure that personal information is destroyed and not used for this purpose. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, I just have a couple of questions. In your submission, you talk about the fact that you're concerned about the lack of ministerial oversight of the census, and you point out that you've written 2 letters to the Prime Minister with no substantive response. Can you tell us a bit more about those letters?
Yes.
requested?
We wrote 2 letters. The first letter was basically a situation of as outlined in our submission, that our concerns about the changes to the census, and the second letter was to do with the census, the use of IBM in relation to contracting out to run the census. And those are the 2 letters we sent. Do you want copies? Your
submission gives us an internet link, I think, to those letters.
Oh, it's on our website in any event, so very easy to find. We haven't had a substantive response to... We have had a response, but not a substantive response.
Okay. So the issue of the ministers in quick succession having limited oversight of the census, would you like to elaborate on that? What impact do you say that's had on the outcome? Well, it's hard to elaborate really, except to observe that that's what was happening at the time. There was... look, at the end of the day, I think it's the ABS who gets to speak on what ministerial oversight they had or not. But from an outside observer, there was very little ministerial involvement, and when the issues broke with the public raising enormous concerns, the minister responsible came out and said, oh, well, there's no problem, I'll be completing my census.
Perhaps if I could add to that, Chair, there's 2 separate aspects to this. One is that the rapid passage of ministers through that role in that period meant that there was no understanding in the hands of those ministers. They'd had no opportunity to be briefed to learn their way into the job. And that's why they had to say very vague things each time they were hauled before the media. The second aspect is that there's a school of thought, certainly pursued by Dr. Kalish, that the minister has very little to do with any of this because it's all within the authority of the ABS. So he would claim. He would even claim that he has an opinion in respect of one aspect of that, which he refuses to make public. So there's a couple of facets here. It may be that no ministerial oversight would be possible, even if a minister was well in place and well informed.
Okay. Senator Hume, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Mr. Clark and Ms. Lane, you heard, I saw you sitting in the back, that the School of Demography has specifically requested better use of linkages to improve the quality of research. Surely that would, the ability to implement those linkages relies upon better use or more efficient use or of identifiers, or indeed, keeping the names available for longer, or the identifiers available for longer on the data used for the census, in the census.
Firstly, I do want to say the Australian Privacy Foundation supports the census as aggregated statistical data. We don't want to get confused, anybody to be confused that we don't support the census. We support the census as it was before and not as it is now. In terms of the linkage keys, the issue is that re-identification is a real and pressing problem. The Privacy Commissioner is doing work on re-identification and going to issue a guide, and you can ask them, about re-identification because it's such a live issue. My colleague, Mr. Clark, knows a lot more about the academic articles on re-identification, but let's just put it this way. There is profound evidence that the re-identification process is incredibly sophisticated, and so the only way to properly protect people from being re-identified with personal information is to not have that personal information, like name, in there in the first place. And that really is the bottom line. If you want to protect Australians from being re-identified through unique identifier keys, then it absolutely has to not include sensitive personal identification. Do you want to add anything?
Yes, if I could just expand on that a little. Something that appears to be overlooked and to have been overlooked by the ABS during this current phase, wasn't overlooked 15 and 20 years ago, is that the quality of the data that exists in surveys or arises from surveys is totally dependent on the public's trust in the organisation collecting the data. Once you have breaches, and it's 5 separate breaches of trust that the ABS perpetrated in this particular census, once you've got that and once the word gets around the community, that undermines, or it shows the lack of respect for privacy, it undermines that trust. So the quality of the data that you're going to get is extremely low. A second aspect of that is that the proposals from Dr. Kalish are that the census will be identified. Each census's data will be linked to data arising from other censuses in respect of each individual in the country. And beyond that, data will be expropriated from government agencies and added into that collection, still identified to the individual. Now, that data arose in many cases because of mandatory powers of government agencies and on an understanding that that data was for particular purposes. So there's been a breach of that form of trust as well. So the quality of data and the quality of, or the preparedness of the public to provide data and to participate in this spirals downwards when that kind of breach of trust arises.
What's your evidence that there has been a breach of trust in the community? I mean, the take-up of this census has been higher than ever before.
Excuse me, that's not, that isn't correct. The data that's been provided by Dr. Kalish shows that it has worsened. It has worsened less than had been anticipated. Now, we're entirely dependent on Dr. Kalish's public statements about that. We've seen no data published that we can analyse. The particularly difficult one for Dr. Kalish and for anybody else looking at the data is the quality of what is inside those responses. We have seen enormous amounts of evidence. We've provided a considerable amount of that in what we've provided and in what we have available on our website. Large numbers of people, many more than we have been used to getting, have been hitting our website and have been approaching us with their concerns.
Well, I'd also like to add that people were threatened with fines and harassed by the census collectors. We referred to the evidence in our submission. And in fact, it's all over social media of people, and I can personally attest. I deliberately didn't put my census in on time, absolutely deliberately didn't, because to find out what harassment would happen. And I can tell you the harassment was worse than, say, debt collectors. I got people at my door every second day. My daughter was, we have a do not knock sticker on our door because we don't like salespeople. Didn't matter. They knocked on the door. They were aggressive about the fact that you had to complete it. I'm personally attesting to this. But social media is full of people who are harassed. So, again, how are you building trust with the public if you're doing a census by force? With harassment as your main way of making sure everybody completes it.
Well, surely before the e-census was implemented, census data collectors knocked on doors anyway. I don't think that was considered harassment.
Well, this is actually, I would consider this harassment. I mean, in my other job, I'm a credit lawyer. And as far as I'm concerned, if they had to comply with the debt collection laws, they'd be in breach. So I don't have any doubts it's harassment. It's the unending, the threats, the letters, you have to do this, constant contact. I mean, all those things are banned for debt collectors, and yet the census collectors have no such provisions in place. And there were many people who contacted us who completed the census because they were harassed.
I'd put to you that the idea that the change that you've written here, that the aggregated statistical data has now turned into personal tracking, that the change from statistics to surveillance might be drawing a long bow, slight overreach, or maybe colourful language?
No, I don't think so. There is plans for the use of a unique identifier on every citizen in Australia, including, babies and people who haven't had any chance to consent. If you use personal identification on that and it gets re-identified, then it is tracking and surveillance. If you create a unique identifier for every citizen in Australia that is comprised of your name, your date of birth and your sex, and that is, well, if they were using the statistical linkage key, which most government departments use, that's not even, it's just so easily identifiable as to be laughable. Then you've created an Australia card. I don't think we are... Creating a unique identifier for every citizen is an Australia card. And citizens of Australia strongly objected to that years ago. And this is not rhetoric or hyperbole. This is simply a problem of tracking people and exposing people to risk of re-identification if it proceeds.
Just to add to that, one of the strong areas of evidence that we've drawn on is Dr. Kalish's statements about where he wants the Australian Bureau of Statistics to go. And again, I can provide you with that series of quotations if you want them.
Do you have any evidence that the government, any government agencies are actually using those unique identifiers?
If you're talking about the statistical linkage key, it's on record that the Department of Social Services and the Department of Health both use statistical linkage keys.
The same statistical linkage key that's used in the census?
We believe so, but the problem with the ABS, the problem with the ABS is we actually don't know what they're doing because their privacy impact assessment was so vague as that nobody in Australia, including yourselves, could work out what they're doing. And so that's a problem.
If their privacy impact statement was clearer, perhaps more transparent, would that satisfy you?
It would have needed to have satisfied all of the conditions laid out in the Commonwealth Privacy Commissioner's guidelines. It fell so far short of them that it would have to be completely revamped and redesigned. It was not just a slight drop short, it was a total failure.
They failed to comply with our own Privacy Commissioner's guidelines. That's a serious failure. That's what the Privacy Commissioner is there for, to protect us, our citizens, to make sure that our privacy and our control over our personal information is properly done. If you look at the Privacy Commissioner's submission, or they told me personally, I was told when I went to meet the ABS that they consulted the Privacy Commissioner. Well, no, they hadn't in any meaningful way. They really disregarded privacy throughout the entire process. If a privacy impact assessment was done properly, it would have been done externally, it would have been rigorous, it would have complied with the Privacy Commissioner's guidelines. None of those things happened with this assessment. So everybody in Australia, that's everyone, can actually feel that their privacy hasn't been adequately protected through the ABS process because he hasn't adequately considered their privacy or consulted properly with the Privacy Commissioner.
Kalish's statement to us on the 19th of February was, quote, "This process also included consultation with the Australian Privacy Commissioner as well as state and territory privacy commissioners," unquote. And we can't find evidence of any outcomes of those consultations.
Well, in fact, if you call the Privacy Commissioner, I think they'd tell you that they weren't properly consulted at all.
Would you agree that there is a trade-off between the quality of data and the quality of research, therefore, that you can that comes out of that data, and the amount of information that is collected in the census?
Perhaps I should answer that because I'm a university researcher as well. Yes, but it's a complex relationship because, as I indicated earlier, the quality of the data that you have available depends upon the context in which it's being collected. And accuracy and precision and all of the other quality factors will be undermined if the people you're collecting it from don't behave the way you want them to and don't provide accurate data. And trust is crucial to that collection process.
So in previous years, before this issue, before this became an issue, there has been questions about the quality of data that has been collected from the census, and that is not necessarily just an Australian experience. It happens all over the world. And I think I mentioned to Mr McClellan this morning that an obscene number of people identified themselves as Jedi Knights in previous censuses. So, potentially I put to you that the quality of data in this particular census potentially may be no different to that in previous censuses.
I'm sorry, Deputy Chair, but I don't understand your logic, because what we've been putting to you is that the level of trust has plummeted for very good reasons which have been presented to you, and the quality of data that's collected depends on trust. If the trust plummets, the quality plummets. Whether it plummets from a not very good level downwards or from a really, really good level downwards obviously depends on history, but it plummets.
And the Jedi campaign was a social media campaign, and I think that arguably it was just one campaign. And it was driven by some issues, social media. So, I mean, it's hard to understand social media at the best of times, but I would argue that was a one-off.
Do you think that potentially the privacy issues has been a social media-driven campaign as well this time around? That it's been, G'd up by the use of social media? perhaps overstated?
Social media G's up a lot of things, and but look, at the end of the day, what I found by talking to people is that people just got this. They said the countless people just got the issue, which is that the government doesn't need my name. They don't. They shouldn't. If people want to give it, that's fine. But if I don't want to give it because I have a particular religion or a particular thing or a particular, I don't want to give it. And the people got that very simple concept, and that's why it flew off on social media. The ABS wants to blame everyone. It seems everyone for all of its problems, but its problems were created by itself. But look, the reason this took off in social media is because it captured the public's imagination. The Australian Privacy Foundation is a tiny little voluntary organisation. Bill McLennan is an ex-chief statistician. We could not ignite a social media campaign at the best of times. It took off because it resonated with people. It resonated with everyday Australians who said, no, I don't want to give the government my name because it's none of their business. This is about aggregated statistical data, not having my name. And they also intuitively understood that that's just a risk that they didn't want to take. Now, nobody's saying people can't give their name if they want to. But the issue is that the ABS went out and told everybody in Australia it was compulsory, when in fact that legal advice is under enormous cloud and he won't release it. So you've got a situation where everybody in Australia was misled, and it resonated with people being, one, the authoritative thing of telling them what to do. Australians don't particularly like that. I certainly don't. And second, they just got the simple idea that they shouldn't have to give their name.
If I can just clarify a couple of further things as well, Deputy Chair. You've echoed the sorts of things that have been said by the ABS itself, by a number of social scientists, just now by the ANU demographers. Lots of assertions about overstatements and exaggerations. Not one of those sources that I've been able to find has ever come forward with demonstration of expertise in privacy attitudes and the impacts of public trust on quality of data. Not one of them quotes citations and studies that evidence what is going on out there and how people react. What we do is to investigate these things where we can and to provide evidence where we can. And we're aware of, and we presented a lot of information about, a lot of people in the public who are upset about various aspects of this. Bear in mind that privacy is a background factor. For most people, most of the time, it isn't an issue. Occasionally it surfaces, and for different people it's different circumstances and different issues that surface. And then there's an explosion. And in the last 20 years, the media is so attuned to these, because they're now well informed by successive breaches, that they run with it. And the same happens with social media. It runs with it. Now, would we vouch for every story that appears even in the professional media, let alone in social media? Obviously not. They pick up some of ours and they don't pick up others, and they misunderstand some of the things we say. That's society. But the point is that there is a great deal of evidence of a great deal of impact on society.
Thank you. I've got no more questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. And just in response to your opening statement, Ms Lane, I just wanted to assure you that we did invite the Privacy Commissioner to come, and he had provided us with a submission. Unfortunately, wasn't available to be here today, so that's unfortunate. Okay, so Senator Griff, do you have any? Yes, question?
Not with me.
Oh, and Senator Xenophon, do you have any questions?
Just in terms of the concerns of the Privacy Foundation, would your concerns be lessened if the names were kept only until the verification was done in those for that the ABS is referred to? In other words, that the names were destroyed after that period closed for verification?
The administrative use for the purposes of managing the logistics of data collection is long, well established. It was well understood by the Australian public up until the 2011 census, and that's part of the process. There was public trust in the ABS's ability to do that, to have such names as were provided, which may or may not have been the name usually used by the person, but those names were used as a control mechanism, and there were no privacy issues arising from that I'm aware of, and I've been involved in privacy and the census since 1976, so I've never known of any issues with it, Senator Xenophon.
Sure, thank you. And look, the only other question I have is that, and you may want to take this on notice, in terms of your concerns with respect to privacy in the context of the ABS's rebuttal to the issues on your website, and this is page 117 of the ABS's submission, they deal with a number of matters relating to your submission where they rebut your concerns. Is that something that you're in a position to comment on now, or do you wish to comment on it on notice?
We'd certainly like the opportunity to comment on notice, but my impression was that we had no case to answer because there was nothing in there. We'll have another look and provide a statement to that effect, or in more detail if it warrants it.
I had the same impression when I reviewed the appendix in the ABS submission. I think they just fundamentally wanted to ignore the issue we were raising about the unique identifiers, and that's the issue. That's the key issue, and that's the re-identification risk, and that's the thing they haven't addressed. So it seemed to me that they hadn't addressed our issues at all, and seemingly wanted to pretend that that they'd addressed them, and when they still haven't addressed the fundamental issue.
Can I respectfully suggest saying that there's no case to answer may not be entirely useful for the purpose of this inquiry. If you could actually try and tackle head on some of the points made by the ABS, I would personally find that quite useful.
We will definitely do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I don't have any further questions, so I just wanted to thank you very much for appearing before us today. And I just wanted to place on the record that the date by which responses to questions on notice should be provided is Monday the 7th of November.